Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Bree. This is a video I've been hesitating to do because I know whichever side I land on is going to piss people off. Is Bomberman actually any good? If I say yes, then the people who know it ain't are going to say bullshit. And if I say no, the people who know it is are going to say fuck off. Right? Because Bomberman is a prolific game franchise. It's extremely popular. It's been released in some form or capacity on nearly every game console ever made since its inception, including game consoles that were not successful. And it's been released in so many various incarnations. There's no standard Bomberman. You can look at Pac-Man, Tetris, Mario, and you can say that is, at its core, a Pac-Man, Tetris, or Mario game. But Bomberman, it's kind of like, well, this one it does this, and that one it does that. Well, I mean, at its core, they all have a guy placing bombs blowing up bricks. That's the only thing they all have in common. Some of them are top-down, some of them are side-scrolling, some of them are 3D, some of them are 2.5D. Some of them are pseudo 3D. The list goes on. Some of them are multiplayer. Some of them are not. Some of them the goal is to find the exit. Some of them the goal is to collect the most power-ups. Some of them the goal is to defeat the enemies. Every game is different. So, is Bomberman any good? Well, yes and no. Yes, there are good games under the Bomberman umbrella, in the Bomberman franchise, that are legit good games. Is Bomberman itself a compelling character? No. It has no backstory. It's just I don't know what it is. The backstory doesn't matter. Well, technically Pac-Man doesn't have a backstory. So not having much of a fleshed out backstory doesn't really make it not good, right? I guess. But when you play multiplayer Bombermans, everybody's a different color Bomberman. There's no central Bomberman character. And in my experience, which is very limited, by the way, I'll admit, they don't really have robust, fleshed out single player modes. None that you're going to want to play. As a party game, depending on which version you're playing, which console you're on, yeah, it's a good party game. Super Bomberman on the SNES with the multi-tap, yeah, that's a good game. Bomberman 64 with 4 controllers on the Nintendo 64. That's a good game. Bomberman Jetters on the GameCube? No, that is not a good game. That game was rubbish. Bomberman Super R, whatever it's called, on the Switch. Did anybody buy that game? Because every time I come across it in a used video game store, which is never, they want like $70 for it. That's usually an indicator that nobody bought it, because it never came down in price. Because it's rare. Right? Am I wrong? That tends to be the case with Bomberman games. They tend to be expensive because they don't really sell well. They sell well enough that they make enough profit because they're low budget to make, that the company who owns the license, I think it's Bandai, I'm not 100% on that, can make money off of it. But beyond that, be honest. You invite friends over to play a video game. You bust out the N64. You're gonna pull out GoldenEye, Mario Kart, Mario Party, any number of games before you get down to Bomberman. I played a lot of Bomberman back in the day with my friends. But we were playing the TurboGrafx 16 version on the Virtual Console of the Nintendo Wii, because that's the version we had, and there weren't a lot of good, compelling multiplayer games in the early days of the Wii. You know, you had the Wii Sports package, and then that was it. Really. Most of the Wii games, a lot of them were like, yeah, there were like the shovelware, yes. But most of them were single-player experiences. Bomberman doesn't have a consistent aesthetic. It doesn't have a consistent gameplay formula from one game to the next. It doesn't have a consistent preference for multiplayer over single-player. It's kind of like sometimes the multiplayer is fleshed out and the single-player is tacked on. Other times they did their best on the single player and they just added the multiplayer because it had to be there. It just feels like each Bomberman game is hit or miss. Well, that's standard in a franchise. I could probably list off 12 Mario games that suck. Maybe not mainline Mario games, but I could find 12 games that are, published by Nintendo on Nintendo consoles that sold well to Nintendo fans that are not good games. So yeah, just because I can find bad Bomberman games doesn't mean he's bad, right? Because Mario's pretty fucking awesome, even though most of his games are pretty fucking dope. Don't get me wrong. He's got some goddamn good games. Does Bomberman? Like, I've played the TurboGrafx Bomberman, the NES Bomberman, the N64 Bomberman, the Dreamcast Bomberman, the Saturn Bomberman, the Genesis, the Super NES, the GameCube, and then that's it. Those are the various Bombermans I've played. Now, granted, that might not be every Bomberman that's out there, but that's every one of them that people play. So I'll take them one by one. I'm just going to go thumbs up, thumbs down. Bomberman on the NES, that's a thumbs down. That game is rubbish. Not worth your fucking time. Super Bomberman on the SNES, the US North American release one, not the sequels that were exclusive to Japan. Can't play those. I don't live in Japan. I don't have a Japanese Famicom. Super Famicom. Okay. Not bad. If you got the multi-tap, and you have the controllers, and you've got 4 friends, or 5 friends, or whatever it takes, yeah, it's a fun game. It might not be the greatest multiplayer experience on the SNES, but it's not the worst multiplayer experience on the SNES either. Mega Bomberman on the Genesis, not really. Not a good game. Saturn Bomberman, only if you connect it to the internet, which you can't do anymore, so you also have to pay like $300 for a disc. So, maybe good back in the day when it was accessible, not worth it today. N64 Bomberman, playable, but disorienting. The 3D doesn't really work well. Dreamcast Bomberman, that one was good. I'll give you that. And I don't even like the Dreamcast. Bomberman Jetters on the GameCube, I love the GameCube. It's one of my favorite game consoles of all time. I played probably 70% of the games on the GameCube. I owned a good 100 and something plus games back in the day when the GameCube was my dedicated home console. Bomberman Jetters, mediocre. It's not hot rubbish, but it's not great. It's mediocre. It didn't really satisfy. It didn't do it for me. And I got rid of my Switch before I was able to buy the Bomberman on the system. And I wouldn't have had friends with a Switch or had an opportunity to play it multiplayer anyways. So I can't really say I would have had a fun time with it. I can't comment on the quality of it. It could have been the best thing in the franchise. I don't know. So is Bomberman actually any good? Like I said, some are, some aren't. Yeah, as a franchise, there are some worthwhile Bomberman games. And as a multiplayer experience, even if it's not the greatest multiplayer experience on the console that's available, it's still worth your time. I still think if you have an SNES and you want it to be a multiplayer system, you're going to want Bomberman. Super Bomberman. Same with N64, same with Dreamcast. Now, I don't know about Bomberman Jetters, but there may have been another Bomberman on the GameCube. I don't remember. Bomberman Jetters was trying to make Bomberman into a, quote, proper video game. As in, it was trying to be like a kind of sort of open world exploration, action adventure type game. Instead of just a here's a maze, blow up bricks game. And it failed at it. They did a lot of experimentation like that in the PS2 GameCube era. Some of it worked, some of it didn't. Bomberman Jetters is one that didn't. But hey, at least they were trying new things. I gotta give them that. At least they weren't remaking fucking remakes. Like they are today. Yeah, I like Bomberman. I think as a whole, it's a pretty good franchise. I think as a whole, there's some good quality fun to be had in a Bomberman game. You know, and a lot of times, like on the TurboGrafx or the Dreamcast, sometimes the Bomberman game is one of the breakout games on the console.